The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked linoleum of Evelyn Martinez's kitchen as she folded the foreclosure notice for the third time, her weathered fingers trembling not from age, but from the weight of impossible decisions. At 73, she had buried 2 husbands, raised 5 children on factory wages and Social Security checks, and learned that dignity wasn't something you could deposit in a bank account. The notice gave her 30 days to vacate the only home her grandchildren had ever known her in, the small ranch house with the leaky roof and the garden where she grew tomatoes that tasted like hope itself. "Abuela, you can't be serious about this." Her eldest son, Roberto, stood in the doorway holding his coffee like a weapon, his pressed shirt and polished shoes marking him as the success story of the family. He worked in finance now, drove a BMW, lived in a subdivision where the mailboxes all matched and the grass stayed green year-round. $400 for a lot of sand? That's throwing money away we don't have. Evelyn smoothed the real estate listing across the kitchen table, her finger tracing the boundaries of what everyone else saw as worthless land. 2 acres of sandy soil 40 miles outside the city. No utilities, no road access except a dirt path that disappeared during heavy rains. The seller was desperate, a developer who'd bought it sight unseen and discovered it was impossible to build on, too soft for foundations, too remote for profit. But Evelyn saw something different in the faded photograph. She saw space. She saw the possibility. She saw a place where roots could grow deep enough to find water even in the hardest ground. If this story of unexpected discovery resonates with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring tales that prove dreams are worth pursuing. "It's my Social Security check," she said quietly, not looking up from the listing. "My money to waste." Her daughter Maria laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Mama, you're being ridiculous. You need every penny for the deposit on the senior apartment. This fantasy about buying land. You're too old to be playing pioneer woman." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth mixed with cruelty. Evelyn was old, her back curved from decades of cleaning office buildings at night, her hands spotted and scarred from years of honest work. But inside, where it mattered, she felt as young and fierce as the day she'd arrived from Mexico with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of dreams that everyone had called foolish then, too. "I raised 5 children," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived more than most could imagine. "I kept this family together when your father died. When money was so tight, I made soup from bones and called it feast. I worked 3 jobs when Roberto needed money for college, when Maria needed help with her mortgage, when Carlos was in jail and needed a lawyer. I have given everything I had to this family for 50 years. I am asking for 2 acres of sand." The silence that followed was the kind that lives in houses where love and resentment share the same rooms. Her youngest son, Carlos, shifted uncomfortably by the window, his construction worker's hands still dirty from his morning shift. He'd been the disappointment, the one with the drinking problem and the spotty employment history, the one who borrowed money and took longer to pay it back than he should have. But he was also the one who stayed, who fixed her leaky faucets and changed her light bulbs, who brought his children by every Sunday for dinner, even when he was broke. "Maybe," Carlos said slowly, ignoring the sharp looks from his siblings, "maybe she knows something we don't." Roberto's laugh was everything his mother's wisdom wasn't. Sharp, dismissive, cruel. "What's she going to know about real estate? She cleans offices for a living, Carlos. This isn't some telenovela where the poor grandmother gets rich. This is throwing away money we need for her care." But Evelyn wasn't listening to Roberto anymore. She was remembering her own grandmother, a woman who had raised 13 children in Mexico on nothing but faith and stubbornness, who had planted fruit trees and ground so hard it cracked shovels, who had watered those trees with dishwater and tears, and lived to see them bear fruit that fed 3 generations. That grandmother had never learned to read, had never owned anything more valuable than a cast-iron pot, but she had understood something about the earth that economists and real estate agents never would. "The land chooses you as much as you choose it," she whispered to her once, pressing seeds into her small palm. "Listen with your heart, mija. The earth tells you its secrets if you know how to be still. Evelyn had carried those words through 5 decades in America, through factory jobs and night shifts, through the loneliness of widowhood and the exhaustion of raising children alone. She had planted gardens in every place she'd lived, coaxing life from urban soil and suburban clay, learning to read the language of roots and rain and seasons. And now, looking at this listing for 2 acres of sand that nobody wanted, she felt the same stirring in her chest that she'd felt as a child holding her grandmother's seeds. The next morning, she took the bus 3 hours to see the land, carrying her lunch in a paper bag and wearing her best shoes despite knowing she'd be walking through sand. The real estate agent, a young woman with perfect makeup and practiced sympathy, tried to talk her out of it even as they walked the property lines. "Mrs. Martinez, I have to be honest with you. This land has been on the market for 2 years. 3 different developers have tried to make something work here and failed. The soil won't hold foundations, there's no water access, no power lines. It's really not suitable for anything." But Evelyn wasn't listening to the agent any more than she'd listened to Roberto. She was walking slowly across the sand, feeling the give of it beneath her feet, noticing how it held the impression of her shoes for a moment before the wind smoothed it away. She knelt down, ignoring the protest from her arthritic knees, and scooped up a handful of the sand. It was fine and pale, almost white in the afternoon sun, and when she let it run through her fingers, she caught something that made her heart skip. Mixed in with the sand were tiny fragments of something that caught the light differently, something that sparkled like broken glass but felt smoother, rounder. She rolled one of the fragments between her thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the sun. It was no bigger than a grain of rice, translucent blue-green, beautiful in a way that made her breath catch. "What are these?" she asked the agent, holding out her palm with its collection of glittering fragments. The young woman glanced at them dismissively. "Oh, those are everywhere out here. Some kind of mineral in the sand, I think. Quartz, maybe? The previous owner mentioned them. Worthless, but pretty, I guess. Are you ready to head back? I have another showing at 4. Evelyn closed her fist around the fragments and felt their smoothness against her palm like a promise. "I'll take it," she said. The agent blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The land. I'll buy it. $400. Cash." "Mrs. Martinez, are you sure? I mean, I have a legal obligation to make sure you understand what you're buying. This land has no development potential, no utilities, no road access. You'd essentially be buying 2 acres of sand and scrub brush." Evelyn looked out across her new property, watching the wind move through the hardy grasses that somehow thrived in this impossible soil, seeing how the afternoon light turned the whole landscape golden and warm. In the distance, she could see the outline of mountains, purple and mysterious against the sky. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned. "I understand perfectly. I'm buying 2 acres of possibility." The paperwork took an hour, and by the time the agent dropped her back at the bus station, Evelyn was $400 poorer and the proud owner of land that everyone who loved her thought she was crazy to want. She didn't call her children that night to tell them the deed was done. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with a magnifying glass she'd borrowed from her neighbor, examining the handful of fragments she'd collected from her sand. Under magnification, they were even more beautiful, catching and holding light like tiny windows into some other world. Some were clear as water, others showed hints of blue or green or purple, and a few had inclusions that looked like frozen smoke. She had no idea what they were, but she knew they were important in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the feeling in her chest when she held them. The next morning, she took the bus 2 hours back to see her land, carrying her lunch in a paper bag and wearing her best shoes, despite knowing she'd be walking through sand. And the canvas bag full of tree saplings she'd bought at the garden center with her grocery money. Apple trees she'd chosen because her grandmother had always said fruit trees were an investment in the future, a gift to grandchildren not yet born. The garden center clerk had looked at her like she was insane when she'd explained where she planned to plant them. Ma'am, apple trees need good soil, regular water, and protection from wind. What you're describing sounds like, well, like a desert. These trees won't survive out there. But Evelyn had smiled and paid for the saplings anyway because she'd learned long ago that there was a difference between what experts said was possible and what love could make happen. She'd raised 5 children on love and stubbornness and faith in tomorrow, and she figured that was enough to raise a few apple trees too. The work was harder than she'd expected. The sand was loose and kept filling in the holes as fast as she could dig them, and by noon her back was screaming and her hands were blistered despite her gloves. But she kept digging, pausing only to drink water from the thermos she'd brought and to examine the fragments of whatever they were that turned up in every shovelful of sand. By evening, she had planted 12 apple saplings in what she hoped was good soil beneath the sand, their slender trunks staked against the wind, their roots nestled in holes she'd filled with compost and hope. They looked impossibly fragile against the vast landscape, like green exclamation points in a sentence written in sand and sky. As she gathered her tools and prepared to walk back to the road where Carlos was picking her up, Evelyn found herself whispering the same words her grandmother had spoken over seeds planted in impossible ground. Grow strong, little ones. Find the water. Find the light. Show them all what's possible. Standing there in the fading light, Evelyn Martinez felt rich for the first time in her life, but the real battle was just beginning. The first winter nearly broke everything, including Evelyn's spirit. The apple saplings she'd planted with such hope bent almost horizontal under winds that seemed to howl straight from the Arctic, their small branches whipping like desperate hands reaching for mercy that never came. Snow mixed with sand created a gray slush that froze solid at night and turned to treacherous mud during the brief warm spells, making the dirt road to her property impassable for weeks at a time. Evelyn made the journey anyway, taking 2 buses and walking the final 3 miles when the road was too muddy for Carlos to drive his pickup truck. She carried water in milk jugs, heavy and awkward, sloshing against her legs as she trudged through sand that sucked at her shoes with each step. Her back, already curved from decades of hard labor, protested every step of the way, but she kept walking because the trees needed her, and she had learned long ago that need was stronger than pain. "This is insane, Mama." Maria stood in the doorway of the senior apartment complex, where the family had finally convinced Evelyn to look at available units. The apartments were clean and safe, with handrails in the bathrooms and emergency pull cords in every room, designed for people who had reached the age where falling down could mean dying alone. "You're killing yourself over some dead trees in the middle of nowhere. Look at this place, meals included, activities, people your own age. You could have a life here." But Evelyn looked around the sterile common room with its beige walls and artificial plants and felt something inside her shrivel like fruit left too long in the sun. The other residents sat in chairs arranged in precise rows facing a television that blared game shows at a volume designed for failing ears. They looked comfortable and safe and utterly, completely finished with the business of living. She understood then that there were different kinds of death, and some of them came with meal plans and scheduled activities. "My trees aren't dead," she said quietly, signing the lease anyway because her children's worry was becoming its own kind of weight, and she was tired of carrying everyone else's fears along with her own. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the parking lot and a small balcony just big enough for a single chair. Evelyn moved her belongings in 3 trips, carrying everything she owned in boxes that Carlos loaded and unloaded with the quiet efficiency of someone who disagreed with what he was doing but loved the person asking him to do it. The last thing she packed was a mason jar filled with the sparkling fragments she'd been collecting from her land, hundreds of them now, ranging in size from grains of rice to small pebbles. "What are you going to do with those rocks, Abuela?" Carlos's daughter, Sophia, was 8 years old and still believed that adults had logical reasons for everything they did. She held the jar up to the light, watching the fragments catch and scatter tiny rainbows across the apartment's white walls. "I don't know yet, mija," Evelyn admitted, taking the jar from her granddaughter's small hands. "But I think they're waiting to tell me something important." Roberto, who had been suspiciously quiet during the move, chose that moment to clear his throat with the authority of someone about to deliver unwelcome news. "Actually, Mama, I had those things analyzed by a friend of mine who works in geology, just to be sure they weren't anything valuable, you understand." Evelyn felt her heart stop, then start again with a rhythm that felt different, faster. "And?" "Worthless. Some kind of industrial waste, probably. Silicon carbide, maybe some crushed glass. The whole area was probably a dumping ground at some point. I'm sorry, Mama, but there's nothing special about your rocks." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because she had been counting on the fragments being valuable, but because Roberto's tone suggested he was relieved to deliver this news. He wanted her rocks to be worthless. He wanted her dreams to be foolish. He wanted to be right about the land being a mistake so badly that he had gone behind her back to have them tested, not to help her, but to prove her wrong. "I see," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Thank you for finding out." That night, alone in her new apartment with its thin walls and the constant hum of fluorescent lights, Evelyn lay awake listening to the sounds of other people's televisions and wondered if this was how dreams died. Not in dramatic crashes, but in slow suffocation, buried under layers of sensible decisions and other people's certainty about what was possible.
The apple trees had survived the winter. Barely. 3 of the 12 had died, their brown branches brittle as old bones, but 9 remained, their buds swollen with the promise of spring. Evelyn knelt beside each surviving tree, checking the soil moisture, examining the bark for signs of disease or pest damage, whispering encouragement the way her grandmother had whispered to struggling plants, in another language, in another country, in another lifetime that felt simultaneously distant and immediate. As she worked, she noticed something that made her catch her breath. Where the 3 dead trees had been, the sand was different. Instead of the pale, fine consistency she'd grown accustomed to, the soil here was darker, richer, mixed with something that looked almost like compost but smelled of minerals and deep earth. And scattered throughout this different soil were more of the sparkling fragments, but these were larger, more defined, some of them showing clear crystal faces that caught the morning sun like tiny prisms. Evelyn dug carefully around one of the dead trees, following its root system down into sand that grew stranger with every inch. 2 feet down, her shovel struck something solid. Not rock, not clay, but something that rang like metal when struck. She dug more carefully now, using her hands to clear away sand and what she was beginning to suspect wasn't sand at all. What she uncovered made her sit back on her heels and laugh, a sound that started as hysteria and transformed into something closer to joy. The dead tree's roots had found their way into a vein of something that definitely wasn't industrial waste. The material was crystalline, formed in complex geometric patterns that no factory could produce, ranging in color from deep purple to pale blue to clear as water. Some pieces were small enough to hold in her palm, others large enough that she couldn't budge them with her shovel. She filled her pockets with samples, choosing the clearest and most beautiful pieces, and spent the rest of the day digging around the other dead trees. Each one had found the same vein of crystalline material, each root system mapping the underground treasure like a living blueprint drawn in wood and earth and time. By evening, Evelyn's back was screaming, and her hands were raw despite her gloves, but she had collected enough samples to fill a small bucket. The fragments were heavier than they looked, with a density that spoke of deep formation, of pressure and time and geological forces beyond her understanding. But she didn't need to understand them to know they were important, to feel the rightness of their weight in her hands like prayers finally answered. The bus ride back to town gave her 2 hours to think about what Roberto had told her, about industrial waste and worthless rocks, and geology friends who apparently couldn't tell the difference between factory refuse and whatever she'd spent the day uncovering. Either Roberto's friend was incompetent, or Roberto had lied about having the samples analyzed at all. Given her son's history of believing he knew what was best for everyone else, Evelyn suspected the latter. She didn't confront him about it. Instead, she took her bucket of samples to the public library and spent the next 3 weeks reading everything she could find about minerals and crystals and geological formations. The librarian, a kind woman named Helen, who remembered when libraries were places where people came to learn rather than just use the internet, helped her navigate reference books and scientific journals, teaching her to recognize the technical language that described what she was increasingly certain she had found. The breakthrough came when she discovered a geology textbook with a chapter on precious stones. There, on page 247, was a photograph that made her hand shake as she held it up next to one of her samples. The match was perfect. The same color, the same crystal structure, the same way of catching and holding light like captured sky. Sapphires. She had been digging sapphires out of her sandy lot, mistaking them for worthless rocks because nobody had bothered to look carefully, because the land was too remote and too worthless for anyone to imagine it might be hiding treasures beneath its surface. That night, Evelyn called the one person she trusted to keep a secret until she decided what to do with it. "Carlos, it's your mother. Can you come pick me up tomorrow morning? I want to show you something at the land." Her youngest son's voice was careful, the way it got when he was trying not to say something that would hurt her feelings. "Mama, it's supposed to rain tomorrow. The road's going to be mud." "Then we'll walk. This is important, mijo. More important than mud." The next morning dawned gray and threatening, but Carlos showed up at her apartment complex at 8 a.m. with coffee for both of them and the resigned expression of someone who had learned that arguing with her mother was like arguing with the weather, pointless and exhausting. They drove in companionable silence to the end of the paved road, then parked and began the 3-mile trek across increasingly soft ground toward her property. "You know the family thinks you're losing it, right?" Carlos said as they navigated around a particularly deep puddle. "Roberto has been talking about power of attorney, about making decisions for your own good."
Evelyn felt a flash of anger so sharp it surprised her. "And what do you think?" Carlos was quiet for a long time, concentrating on not slipping in the mud. Finally, he said, "I think you've been taking care of yourself longer than any of us have been alive. I think maybe we should trust you to know what you're doing." When they reached her land, Evelyn led her son directly to the area where she'd been digging around the dead apple trees. The rain had washed away much of her previous work, but it had also exposed more of the crystalline material, which now showed clearly in veins running just beneath the surface of the sandy soil. "Carlos," she said, kneeling beside the largest exposure and brushing sand away from a cluster of crystals the size of her fist, "what do you see?" Her son knelt beside her, his construction worker's hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted one of the crystals to examine it in the gray morning light. "Jesus, Mama, what is this stuff?" "Your brother Roberto told me they were worthless, industrial waste, but I've been reading, mijo. I've been learning. And I think we might have a different kind of problem than being too poor." Carlos held the crystal up to what little light filtered through the clouds, watching it throw tiny rainbows despite the overcast sky. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying your grandmother might not be as foolish as everyone thinks, and I'm saying we need to be very, very careful about who we tell." They spent the rest of the morning walking the property, finding evidence of the crystalline veins in unexpected places, sometimes just beneath the surface, sometimes exposed by erosion or the work of burrowing animals. The material seemed to run in irregular bands across much of the 2 acres, concentrated heaviest where the 3 apple trees had died, but present in smaller quantities almost everywhere they looked. By noon, they had filled 2 buckets with samples, choosing only the pieces that were already loose or easily extracted. The rain had intensified, turning their clothes heavy and their footing treacherous, but neither of them suggested leaving. This felt too important, too fragile, like a moment that would determine everything that came after. "What do we do now?" Carlos asked as they loaded the buckets into his truck. Evelyn looked back at her land, at the 6 surviving apple trees bent but not broken by the storm, at the sandy soil that everyone said was worthless and that might just change everything for her family. "Now we find out what we really have, but quietly, Carlos, very quietly." The drive back to town was different from the drive out. The silence felt electric now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Evelyn held one of the larger crystals in her lap, feeling its weight like a secret that was still deciding whether to be a blessing or a curse. That evening, she sat in her sterile apartment surrounded by buckets of potential fortune, thinking about her grandmother's words about listening to the earth, about how the land chose you as much as you chose it. She had thought she was buying 2 acres of sand because she needed a place to plant trees and dreams. But maybe the land was waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig deep, patient enough to plant apple trees in impossible ground, foolish enough to believe that worthless could be priceless if you just knew how to look. Outside her window, the city sparkled with lights that promised safety and comfort and everything her family wanted for her. But Evelyn found herself staring past those lights toward the darkness where her land waited, where roots were growing deeper every day, where sapphires slept in sand that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. She was beginning to understand that the biggest struggles weren't always about having enough money or finding safe places to live. Sometimes the biggest struggle was believing that miracles could still happen to grandmothers with arthritic hands and social security checks, to women who had spent their whole lives making something from nothing and were about to discover that nothing had been something precious all along. The confirmation came 3 weeks later from a gemologist in the city. Evelyn sat across from Dr. Chen's cluttered desk, watching the woman examine crystal after crystal under powerful magnification, occasionally making notes in handwriting so precise it looked like printed text. The silence stretched long enough that Evelyn began to worry she had been foolish again, that Roberto's industrial waste theory would prove correct after all, that she was an old woman chasing fantasies in a world that had no patience for dreamers. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Chen finally said, setting down her loupe and looking directly into Evelyn's eyes, "where exactly did you find these?" "On my land, in the sand. Are they what I think they are?" Dr. Chen picked up the largest stone, a clear blue crystal the size of a robin's egg that had been nestled in the roots of one of the dead apple trees. "This is a natural sapphire, unheated, uncut, probably formed over millions of years under very specific geological conditions, and it's not the only one. Mrs. Martinez, what you've brought me represents one of the finest collections of rough sapphires I've seen outside of a major mining operation." The words hit Evelyn like cold water, shocking and clarifying at the same time. How much would something like this be worth?" "That depends on several factors: size, clarity, color saturation, internal structure. But based on what I'm seeing here," Dr. Chen consulted her notes, running calculations that looked like hieroglyphics to Evelyn's untrained eyes. "Conservative estimate? Just these samples you've brought me, somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000. If the rest of your property shows similar concentrations—" Evelyn's hearing seemed to fade out, replaced by a rushing sound like water moving through underground caves. $50,000. She had lived her entire adult life without ever seeing that much money in one place, had raised 5 children on less than that total, had worked night shifts and double shifts, and borrowed against her future for decades to keep her family fed and housed and safe. And now this woman was telling her that a few buckets of rocks from her worthless sandy lot were worth more than everything she had ever earned combined. "Mrs. Martinez, are you all right?" Evelyn blinked, focusing on Dr. Chen's concerned face.
I'm sorry. This is a lot to take in. What should I do? I mean, what's the next step? That depends on what you want to accomplish. If you're looking to sell quickly, I can connect you with dealers who specialize in rough stones. But Mrs. Martinez, if this property contains what I think it contains, you might want to consider a more comprehensive geological survey before you make any decisions. What you're sitting on could be worth considerably more than these samples suggest. The drive home felt like floating. Carlos gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, while Evelyn sat in the passenger seat clutching Dr. Chen's written appraisal like a lifeline. They had agreed not to tell anyone else in the family until they had a better understanding of what they were dealing with, but the secret felt huge between them, too big for the truck's cab, too explosive for whispered conversations. "Mama," Carlos said as they pulled into the apartment complex parking lot, "we need to be smart about this. Really smart. Money like this, it changes people. It makes people do things they wouldn't normally do." Evelyn nodded, understanding that her son was trying to protect her from something she might not fully comprehend yet. She had been poor her entire life and learned to be invisible in a world that rarely noticed people like her. But wealth would make her visible in ways that could be dangerous, especially for an elderly woman living alone. "Who do we tell? And when?" "Nobody. Not yet. We need to understand what we're dealing with first. Get that survey Dr. Chen mentioned. Find out exactly what's under the ground out there. Then we figure out how to handle the family." But keeping secrets in a family like theirs proved harder than either of them anticipated. Roberto noticed almost immediately that something had changed. His mother seemed different, distracted during their weekly dinners, less concerned about her finances than she'd been since the foreclosure notice. When he asked direct questions about her spending, she gave vague answers that only made him more suspicious. "She's hiding something," he told Maria over lunch at the country club where they both belonged, the kind of place that served overpriced salads to people who had never worried about the cost of groceries. "Ever since she moved into that apartment, she's been acting strange, secretive." Maria stirred her soup with the frustrated energy of someone accustomed to controlling situations that were slipping beyond her influence. "Maybe she's just settling in, adjusting to not having to worry about that ridiculous land anymore." "That's just it. She's still going out there. Carlos has been driving her every weekend and they come back muddy and tired like they've been digging. What could they possibly be doing?" "Digging up those dead trees, probably. You know how she gets attached to hopeless causes."
But Roberto's instincts, sharpened by years of analyzing financial irregularities for his firm, told him this was something bigger than grief over dead apple trees. He hired a private investigator, telling himself it was for his mother's protection, that he needed to know if she was being taken advantage of by scam artists or predatory contractors who targeted vulnerable elderly people. The investigator's report arrived 2 weeks later, along with photographs that changed everything. The pictures showed Evelyn and Carlos working methodically across the property, digging careful holes, filling buckets with material they examined closely before loading into the truck. But more telling were the photos taken with telephoto lenses from the road, showing the exposed veins of crystalline material glinting in the afternoon sun, the organized way they were mapping and cataloging their finds. Roberto stared at the photos for a long time before calling his siblings for an emergency family meeting. "She's mining," he announced without preamble when they gathered in his living room the next evening. "Mama is mining something on that worthless land, and she's been lying to us about it." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes explosions. Elena, the middle child who worked as a nurse and had inherited their mother's practical nature, spoke first. "Mining what? You said yourself there was nothing valuable out there." Roberto's face flushed red, the way it had when he was a child caught in lies. "I may have been premature in that assessment. The point is, she's hiding something significant, and Carlos is helping her." "What do you mean premature?" Maria's voice carried the sharp edge of someone realizing she'd been deceived. "Roberto, did you actually have those rocks tested like you told us?" The admission, when it came, revealed the fault lines that had always run through their family dynamics. Roberto had never had the samples analyzed. He'd dismissed their mother's discovery based purely on his assumption that anything she found on land that cheap had to be worthless. His certainty had been rooted not in evidence, but in his fundamental belief that he understood the world better than an elderly woman who cleaned buildings for a living. "I was trying to protect her," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "From false hopes, from wasting money on testing, from getting her expectations up over nothing." "You were trying to control her," Elena said quietly. "Same as always. Mama does something you don't approve of, so you decide what's best for her without bothering to find out the facts." The argument that followed was 20 years in the making, built from accumulated resentments and competing ideas about responsibility and respect. Roberto insisted he had been trying to protect their mother from disappointment. Maria supported him, arguing that elderly people were vulnerable to wishful thinking and needed family members who could make objective decisions. Elena and Carlos formed an unlikely alliance, united in their belief that their mother deserved to make her own choices, even if those choices seemed unwise to her children. But the argument stopped abruptly when Carlos's phone rang at 9 o'clock, Evelyn's ringtone cutting through their heated voices like an alarm. "Mijo, I need you to come get me, right now. Something has happened." Carlos put the phone on speaker, his face pale. "What's wrong, Mama? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, but there are people at the land. Strange people with equipment. They're digging." The family meeting disbanded in controlled panic. Roberto and Maria followed Carlos to the property, their earlier argument forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. They arrived to find Evelyn standing beside a sheriff's deputy, watching 3 men with metal detectors and portable lights working methodically across her land in the darkness. "Mrs. Martinez," the deputy, a young man who looked barely old enough to drive alone, let alone wear a badge, consulted his notepad with the careful attention of someone trying to get things right. "These gentlemen claim they have permission to conduct geological surveys on this property. Do you know anything about that?" "I never gave anyone permission for anything." Evelyn's voice was steady, but Roberto could see her hands shaking. "This is my land. I have the deed." One of the men with the metal detectors approached them, his equipment beeping steadily as he walked. He was middle-aged, professional-looking, wearing clothing that suggested he was accustomed to working outdoors but could afford high-quality gear. "Mrs. Martinez, my name is David Garrett. I'm a geological surveyor with Apex Mining Consultants. We've been retained to conduct a preliminary assessment of mineral rights on this property."
"Mineral rights?" Roberto stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in despite his confusion. "Who retained you, and under what authority?" Garrett consulted his own clipboard, the beam of his headlamp making his face appear ghostly in the darkness. "Our client prefers to remain confidential for now, but I can tell you we have documentation suggesting this property may contain significant mineral deposits. We're within our legal rights to conduct non-intrusive surveys." "That's not how mineral rights work," Elena said, surprising everyone with her knowledge of something outside her nursing expertise. "My ex-husband worked in oil and gas. You can't just survey someone's property because you think it might contain minerals. You need permission from the landowner or existing mineral rights." The deputy looked between the surveyor and the family, clearly in over his head with property law and mineral rights disputes. "Mr. Garrett, I'm going to need to see that documentation you mentioned." What Garrett produced was a contract dated 3 months earlier, signed by someone named Margaret Holloway and witnessed by a notary public. The contract granted Apex Mining Consultants the right to conduct geological surveys and exploratory operations on the property described as 2 acres of sandy soil, 40 miles outside city limits, purchased for $400 by Martinez, Evelyn. The description was too accurate to be coincidental. "Who is Margaret Holloway?" Carlos demanded,
But even as he asked the question, Roberto was putting pieces together with the methodical precision of someone trained to follow paper trails. "She's the real estate agent," Roberto said quietly. "The one who sold Mama the land. She must have retained mineral rights when she sold the surface rights." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If the agent knew or suspected the land contained valuable minerals, she could have sold the surface rights for $400 while keeping the mineral rights for herself. It was legal, if ethically questionable, and it would explain how Garrett's client had learned about the potential deposits on Evelyn's property. "That's impossible," Ilana said, but her voice lacked conviction. "She tried to talk me out of buying it, said it was worthless." "Because she knew it wasn't," Maria said, her business background helping her understand the scope of what had happened. "She knew exactly what was under that land, and she played you." The next hours felt like a nightmare played out in slow motion. The deputy called his supervisor, who called the county attorney, who had to be pulled away from a dinner party to explain mineral rights law on flashlight on a property that had suddenly become the center of a legal dispute none of them understood. The bottom line, when it finally emerged, was both simple and devastating. Margaret Holloway had indeed retained mineral rights when she sold the property. Her contract with Apex Mining Consultants was legal and binding. And while Evelyn owned the surface of the land, including the right to plant trees and build structures, she had no legal claim to anything found beneath the ground. "But that doesn't make sense," Carlos protested. "If she knew what was down there, why sell it all? Why not mine it herself?" The county attorney, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who clearly wished she was anywhere else, explained the economics of mineral extraction. Mining operations require significant capital investment, environmental permits, infrastructure development. It's often more profitable to lease mineral rights to established operations than to develop them yourself, especially on a small scale. "How small scale are we talking about?" Roberto asked, though Elena suspected he already knew the answer. "Based on the preliminary readings we've taken tonight, this property could contain anywhere from $10 to $50 million worth of extractable minerals, possibly more, depending on deposit depth and concentration." The number hung in the air like smoke, visible, but somehow unreal. Evelyn found herself thinking about her grandmother's words about the earth choosing you, about listening for secrets. Had she been chosen for this discovery only to lose it to legal technicalities and her own naivete about property law? "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we conduct a comprehensive survey, map the deposits, determine extraction feasibility, assess environmental impact. The process takes 6 to 8 months, assuming no legal complications. And then we begin mining operations. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that while you don't have mineral rights, you will be compensated for surface disruption. It's standard practice."
Evelyn looked around at her family, seeing her own shock and anger reflected in their faces. Even Roberto, who had been so certain the land was worthless, looked stunned by the magnitude of what they had stumbled into and lost almost simultaneously. "How much compensation?" Carlos asked. "Typically between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on the scope of disruption." $5,000 for the destruction of the land she had bought with her heart, the apple trees she had planted with her hopes, the dreams she had watered with her sweat. $5,000 for 50 million in sapphires that would make someone else wealthy beyond imagination. The ride home was silent except for the sound of Evelyn crying. Quiet tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sadness, from a place where hope went to die. Her children tried to comfort her, Roberto apologizing for his deception about the rock analysis, Maria offering to find lawyers who specialized in mineral rights disputes. But Evelyn barely heard them. She was thinking about her grandmother, about seeds planted in impossible ground, about the difference between choosing your battles and having them chosen for you. Back in her sterile apartment, she sat surrounded by the buckets of sapphires she and Carlos had collected, stones that were simultaneously priceless and worthless, beautiful and useless.
Dr. Chen's appraisal lay on her kitchen table, documenting the value of samples taken from land that was hers only on the surface, only in the most literal and limited sense. The phone rang at midnight. Carlos, checking on her. "Mama, how are you holding up?" "I keep thinking about your great-grandmother, about what she would say about all this." "What do you think she would say?" Evelyn picked up one of the larger sapphires, holding it up to catch the light from her kitchen fixture. Even under harsh fluorescent bulbs, it threw tiny rainbows across the walls. She would say, "The earth gives up its secrets when it's ready, to whoever is ready to receive them." She would say everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see what that reason is yet. "Do you believe that?" Evelyn was quiet for a long time, thinking about fairy tales and real estate contracts, about apple trees planted in sandy soil and sapphires hidden in the roots of the dead. "I believe the story isn't over yet, mijo. I believe we don't know everything there is to know about mineral rights and real estate agents and what's possible when an old woman refuses to give up." "What do you mean?" "I mean, tomorrow I'm going to call Dr. Chen. I'm going to ask her about that geological survey she mentioned, and then I'm going to do some research of my own. Mama, the mineral rights are gone. There's nothing we can do about that." "Maybe. Or maybe there are things about this situation that Margaret Holloway and Apex Mining don't know yet. Things they didn't count on when they decided to take advantage of a foolish old woman with a Social Security check and a heart full of impossible dreams." After she hung up, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad making lists. Things she knew about her property purchase, things she didn't know but could find out. Questions about mineral rights law and real estate disclosure requirements, names of people who might have answers. At 73, she had learned that losing was often just another word for not fighting long enough, and she had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who mistook quiet strength for weakness. Margaret Holloway and Apex Mining were about to discover that stealing dreams from grandmothers was considerably more complicated than their lawyers had probably explained.
The war for her sapphires was just beginning, and Evelyn Martinez had not survived 73 years of poverty, widowhood, and raising 5 children by giving up when the odds looked bad. This incredible legal battle took tremendous courage. If you're enjoying this story of persistence against impossible odds, please share it with someone who needs inspiration today. She had survived by being smarter, tougher, and more persistent than anyone expected an elderly Mexican woman to be. And she was about to remind everyone why underestimating grandmothers was always a mistake. The truth began to unravel on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse, where Evelyn sat surrounded by boxes of documents that smelled like dust and disappointment. She had been coming here every day for 2 weeks, requesting files and deed records and property histories, following paper trails that stretched back 40 years. The county clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy, who remembered when customer service meant actually helping people, had taken pity on the elderly woman with the gentle accent and fierce determination. "Mrs. Martinez, you know most of this information is available online now," Dorothy said, watching Evelyn methodically photograph each page of property records with a disposable camera Carlos had bought her. "I don't trust computers," Evelyn replied, which was only partially true. The fuller truth was that she didn't trust her children not to monitor her internet usage, and she needed to conduct this investigation without Roberto's financial instincts or Maria's protective interference clouding her judgment. What she discovered in those dusty files would have made a fraud investigator proud. Margaret Holloway had not simply retained mineral rights when she sold Evelyn the property. She had acquired those rights through a complex series of transactions designed to obscure the true nature of what she was doing. The original developer, who'd been unable to build on the sandy soil, had sold the land to a shell company called Desert Holdings, LLC. Desert Holdings had then sold the surface rights to Holloway Properties while simultaneously granting mineral rights to Blue Sky Mining Consortium. Blue Sky Mining had then subleased those rights to Apex Mining Consultants. The names meant nothing by themselves, but when Evelyn traced them through business registrations and corporate filings, a pattern emerged that made her hands shake with anger. Margaret Holloway was a partner in Desert Holdings. Her husband, David Holloway, was the registered agent for Blue Sky Mining. Her brother-in-law, Michael Garrett, brother to the surveyor who had appeared on her property, was listed as the primary investor in Apex Mining Consultants. The entire transaction had been a shell game designed to hide the fact that the same family had orchestrated every step of the process, from the original purchase to the mineral rights extraction. They had known exactly what was under that sandy soil, and had probably known for years, and had been waiting for the right moment to acquire it at the lowest possible cost. "Dorothy," Evelyn said, setting down her camera and looking directly at the clerk. "When someone sells property and keeps mineral rights, are they required to tell the buyer?" Dorothy's expression grew careful, the way public employees' faces changed when they sensed they were being asked to give legal advice. "Well, that depends on several factors. Generally speaking, sellers are required to disclose material facts that might affect a property's value. But mineral rights disclosure laws vary by state, and there are exceptions for properties sold as is. What if the seller actively discouraged the purchase? What if they told the buyer the land was worthless? That might be a different situation. That might be fraud, depending on what the seller knew and when they knew it." Evelyn spent the rest of the day in the law library, reading cases about mineral rights fraud and real estate disclosure requirements. The legal language was dense and confusing, full of precedents and exceptions that seemed designed to protect people who could afford good lawyers. But one case kept appearing in her research, a precedent from the state Supreme Court involving a similar situation where sellers had concealed knowledge of valuable mineral deposits while actively discouraging purchases. The ruling was clear. Sellers who possessed specific knowledge of valuable mineral deposits and actively concealed that knowledge while discouraging purchase could be found liable for fraudulent misrepresentation, regardless of whether they technically disclosed mineral rights retention.
That evening, Evelyn called the one person she trusted to understand the implications of what she'd discovered. "Elena, it's your mother. Can you come over? I need to show you something, and I need you to help me understand what it means." Her middle daughter arrived an hour later with takeout Chinese food, and the skeptical expression she wore whenever family members claimed to need her medical expertise for problems that weren't actually medical. But as Evelyn spread out the documents she'd copied, photographs she'd taken, and legal cases she'd printed, Elena's expression shifted from skepticism to fascination to outright fury. "Mama, this is fraud. This isn't just clever legal maneuvering or taking advantage of mineral rights laws. This is outright fraud." "Are you sure?" Elena picked up the timeline Evelyn had constructed, showing the dates of corporate filings, property transfers, and mineral rights assignments. "Look at this. Margaret Holloway incorporated Desert Holdings 6 months before the original developer listed the property for sale. She knew what she was planning from the beginning. And look here." Elena pointed to a geological survey report dated 2 years earlier. They had the land tested before any of these transactions took place. They knew exactly what was down there. Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced since the night she'd first planted her apple trees. Hope mixed with righteous anger, a combination that had powered her through every major challenge of her adult life. What do we do now? Now we call a lawyer, a good one who specializes in fraud and mineral rights. "Elena, lawyers cost money. Good lawyers cost more money than I have." "Mama,
if this case is what I think it is, any good lawyer will take it on contingency. The potential damages here, we're not talking about getting your $400 back. We're talking about claiming ownership of $50 million worth of minerals that were obtained through fraud. But finding the right lawyer proved more complicated than Elena had anticipated. The first 3 firms they contacted weren't interested in taking on a case against Apex Mining, which turned out to have connections to several major law firms in the city. The 4th lawyer they met with, an earnest young man fresh out of law school, admitted he didn't have experience with mineral rights fraud but was willing to learn on the job, hardly the expertise they needed for a case this complex. It was Carlos who found Thomas Chen, Elena's former divorce attorney's brother, who specialized in corporate fraud and had a particular interest in cases involving exploitation of elderly clients. Chen agreed to meet with them on a Saturday morning at his downtown office, reviewing their evidence with the systematic attention of someone who had seen enough corporate deception to recognize the real thing. "This is good work," Chen said after spending 2 hours reviewing Evelyn's documentation. "Very good work. Mrs. Martinez, did you compile all this research yourself?" "My grandmother always said you can't fight what you don't understand. So I made it my business to understand." Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression they'd seen from any of the lawyers they'd consulted. "Your grandmother was a wise woman, and you've built a compelling case here. The question now is whether we can prove intent to defraud, which requires demonstrating that Margaret Holloway knew about the mineral deposits when she sold you the property and deliberately concealed that information while discouraging your mother from purchasing the property." That something arrived 3 days later, delivered by Dorothy from the county courthouse in a manila envelope marked personal and confidential. "Mrs. Martinez, I probably shouldn't be giving you this, but I've been thinking about our conversation, about disclosure requirements and fraud, and I remembered something." Inside the envelope was a copy of an insurance claim filed by Margaret Holloway 18 months earlier, claiming compensation for geological consulting fees and mineral rights research related to potential development opportunities on rural properties. The claim listed specific addresses, including the exact legal description of Evelyn's 2 acres.
Insurance companies require detailed documentation for claims like this, Dorothy explained. "I have a friend who works in insurance fraud investigation, and she helped me understand what this means. Mrs. Holloway was already researching the mineral potential of your property more than a year before she sold it to you. She was being reimbursed by her insurance company for geological surveys and legal research specifically related to mineral extraction." The insurance document was exactly the proof Thomas Chen needed. It established not only that Margaret Holloway had specific knowledge of the mineral deposits before the sale, but that she had invested significant time and money in researching extraction possibilities. Her discouragement of Evelyn's purchase, combined with her retention of mineral rights, now looked less like standard business practice and more like a calculated attempt to defraud an elderly woman out of a fortune. "We file suit tomorrow," Chen announced after reviewing the insurance documents. "Fraudulent misrepresentation, elder abuse, violation of real estate disclosure requirements. We're asking for actual damages, punitive damages, and immediate injunctive relief to stop any mining operations until the case is resolved." The injunction hearing took place in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and broken dreams, presided over by a judge who looked like she'd seen enough corporate shenanigans to be permanently skeptical of anyone wearing an expensive suit. Apex Mining arrived with 3 lawyers and a briefcase full of contracts and mineral rights documentation. Evelyn arrived with Thomas Chen, a folder of evidence, and the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Apex's lawyers argued that their client had acquired mineral rights through legitimate business transactions, that Margaret Holloway's actions were irrelevant to their legal standing, that elderly property owners couldn't simply claim fraud when they discovered they'd made poor financial decisions. Thomas Chen's response was surgical in its precision.
He presented the timeline of corporate formations, the geological survey reports, the insurance claims for mineral rights research, and the recorded conversation from Evelyn's original property viewing, where Margaret Holloway had explicitly stated that the land was worthless and unsuitable for anything, while knowing she possessed documentation proving exactly the opposite. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone presenting an open and shut case. The defendants didn't simply acquire mineral rights through legitimate transactions. They orchestrated a complex fraud designed to separate an elderly woman from what they knew to be extraordinarily valuable property. They created shell companies to obscure their involvement, conducted secret geological surveys to confirm the property's value, then actively discouraged the victim from purchasing land they knew contained millions of dollars in mineral wealth. The judge's questions were pointed and practical. Could Evelyn prove she would have made different decisions if she'd known about the mineral deposits? Could she demonstrate actual damages beyond the $400 purchase price? Could the court provide meaningful relief without disrupting ongoing business operations? Chen's answers were equally practical. Mrs. Martinez had purchased the property specifically for agricultural use, had invested time and money in planting trees and improving the land based on her understanding that she owned both surface and subsurface rights. The fraud had deprived her not only of the mineral wealth itself, but of the opportunity to make informed decisions about development, sale, or mineral rights leasing. As for ongoing operations, Apex Mining had begun their activities based on fraudulently acquired rights, and continuing those operations would compound the original harm. Furthermore, Your Honor, Chen continued, the defendant's own documentation shows they understood they were engaging in questionable practices. The complex corporate structure, the secret surveys, the insurance claims for mineral rights research, these are not the actions of parties engaged in straightforward business transactions. When the hearing ended, the judge announced she would issue her ruling within 48 hours. Evelyn spent those 2 days in a state of suspended animation, too nervous to eat, too excited to sleep, too overwhelmed by the possibility of justice to focus on anything else. The call came on Thursday morning while she was sitting in her apartment trying to force down breakfast she couldn't taste. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Thomas Chen. Are you sitting down?" "Yes." "What did she decide?"
Preliminary injunction granted. All mining operations cease immediately pending resolution of the fraud claims. The judge found sufficient evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation to warrant a full trial, and she specifically noted that allowing mining to continue would cause irreparable harm to your interests. Evelyn felt her knees go weak with relief. What does that mean? What happens now? It means we've won the first battle. Apex can't mine your sapphires while we prove they were obtained through fraud. But, Mrs. Martinez, I want you to understand, this is just the beginning. They're going to appeal, they're going to fight hard, and it could take months or even years to reach a final resolution. Mr. Chen, I'm 73 years old. I've been fighting for things that matter my entire life. A few more months or years doesn't scare me. That afternoon, Evelyn stood on her property for the first time in weeks, watching Apex's crew pack up their equipment under the supervision of a court officer. The apple trees had survived their absence, growing stronger despite the chaos surrounding them. New growth showed green and hopeful on branches that had seemed dead just months earlier. Carlos found her there as the sun was setting, painting the sandy soil gold and making the exposed veins of sapphires sparkle like fairy tales made real. "How do you feel, Mama?" Evelyn knelt beside one of the surviving apple trees, touching its trunk with the same gentle reverence she'd once touched her children's faces when they were small and the whole world was full of possibility. "I feel like your great-grandmother was right. The earth gives up its secrets when it's ready to whoever is ready to receive them. But she never told me the hardest part wasn't finding the treasure. The hardest part was proving you deserved to keep it." "Do you think we'll win?" Evelyn stood slowly, her arthritic knees protesting, but her spirit stronger than it had been in months. Around them, 2 acres of sandy soil held secrets worth $50 million. And beneath that soil, apple tree roots continued their patient work of finding water, finding nutrients, finding ways to grow in impossible ground. Mijo, I planted trees in sand because I believed something beautiful could grow here. I bought this land because I heard it calling to me. I fought Margaret Holloway and Apex Mining because some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds. She picked up a handful of sand mixed with sapphire fragments, letting it run through her fingers like liquid starlight. I think the real question isn't whether we'll win. I think the real question is what we'll do with our victory when it comes. As they walked back toward Carlos's truck, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in the months since the foreclosure notice had arrived. She felt like herself again. Not the elderly woman everyone wanted to protect, not the victim of corporate fraud, not the stubborn grandmother with impossible dreams. She felt like Evelyn Martinez, the woman who had survived poverty and widowhood and raised 5 children on faith and stubbornness, the woman who could make something from nothing and refused to surrender when everyone else said surrender was the only sensible choice. The sapphires glittering in her sandy soil were beautiful, but they weren't the real treasure. The real treasure was remembering that she had never been as powerless as people assumed, never been as naive as her children feared, never been as finished with the business of living as the world expected a woman her age to be. Margaret Holloway and Apex Mining had made the mistake of thinking they could steal dreams from a grandmother who had spent her whole life turning the impossible into the inevitable. They were about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake was going to be. The settlement negotiations took place in a conference room 40 floors above the city, in a building where the elevator required a key card and the coffee cost more than Evelyn had once spent on groceries for a week. She sat at one end of a mahogany table that could have fed her entire extended family, surrounded by lawyers whose hourly rates exceeded her monthly Social Security check, facing representatives of corporations that had tried to steal $50 million from a grandmother who planted apple trees in sandy soil.
Margaret Holloway looked smaller in person than Evelyn had imagined during the long months of litigation, her perfectly styled hair and expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in her eyes. Beside her sat David Garrett from Apex Mining, his confident surveyor's demeanor replaced by the careful neutrality of someone whose company was hemorrhaging money in legal fees while their mining equipment sat idle under court order. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret Holloway's lead attorney began, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone accustomed to cleaning up his client's mistakes, "my client would like to express her regret for any misunderstanding that may have occurred during your property transaction." Thomas Chen's response was immediate and sharp. "Mr. Davidson, we're not here to discuss misunderstandings. We're here because your client orchestrated a complex fraud scheme designed to steal mineral rights worth approximately $50 million from an elderly woman. The only question is whether she'd prefer to settle now or wait for a jury to hear exactly what she did." The number, $50 million, had become more real over the 8 months since the injunction was granted. Additional geological surveys ordered by the court had revealed that Evelyn's 2 acres sat atop what experts described as one of the most significant sapphire deposits discovered in North America in the past 50 years. The crystals ran deeper than anyone had initially suspected, in veins that extended beyond her property boundaries into land owned by the state, creating complex jurisdictional questions that had taken teams of lawyers months to untangle. But complexity worked in Evelyn's favor. The more complicated the legal situation became, the more expensive it grew for Apex Mining and their corporate partners to maintain their position. Every month of delayed extraction cost them money in equipment rentals, legal fees, and lost opportunity costs. Meanwhile, Evelyn's legal fees were covered by Thomas Chen's contingency agreement, and she had learned to find a strange comfort in courthouse waiting rooms and deposition schedules. "What exactly are you proposing?" Davidson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be expensive. Thomas Chen opened a folder containing documents that represented 8 months of investigation, legal research, and strategic planning. Full restoration of mineral rights to Mrs. Martinez, retroactive to the date of the original fraudulent transaction. compensatory damages for lost opportunity costs and emotional distress, punitive damages calculated to ensure this kind of exploitation never becomes profitable, and a public apology acknowledging the fraudulent nature of the scheme. The number, $160 million, when Chen finally stated it, made everyone in the room go silent. $160 million, $50 million in actual damages based on conservative estimates of the Sapphire deposit's value, plus $110 million in punitive damages calculated to make corporate fraud against elderly victims financially devastating rather than merely inconvenient. "That's preposterous," Davidson sputtered. "No jury would award damages of that magnitude." "Mr. Davidson," Chen replied with the calm confidence of someone holding all the good cards, "your client defrauded a 73-year-old widow out of what may be the most valuable mineral deposit in state history. She created shell companies to hide her involvement, conducted secret geological surveys to confirm the property's value, then actively lied to my client about the land's worthlessness while retaining mineral rights she knew were worth tens of millions of dollars. Do you really want to explain to a jury why a woman who cleans office buildings for a living doesn't deserve to benefit from minerals found under land she paid for with her Social Security check?" The negotiations stretched over 3 days, with breaks for phone calls to insurance companies, corporate boards, and bankruptcy attorneys. Apex Mining's position grew weaker each time additional evidence emerged: recorded conversations, email exchanges, financial documents that painted an increasingly clear picture of a sophisticated fraud scheme targeting a vulnerable victim. On the afternoon of the third day, Margaret Holloway herself asked to speak directly to Evelyn, a request that made both legal teams uncomfortable, but that Evelyn agreed to hear. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that this was never personal. It was business. A business opportunity that got out of hand." Evelyn studied the woman who had tried to steal her future, seeing not the confident real estate professional who had discouraged her purchase, but someone who looked older, more tired, diminished by months of legal exposure and public scrutiny. "Miss Holloway, I raised 5 children by cleaning other people's buildings at night while they slept in their comfortable homes. I know the difference between business and theft. What you did to me wasn't business. It was stealing from someone you thought was too old and too poor to fight back. I never meant for it to go this far. When we discovered the mineral deposits, I thought you would be happy with a small compensation payment. I thought you wouldn't understand what you were losing."
"You thought I was stupid." Margaret Holloway's silence was answer enough. "The difference between us," Evelyn continued, "is that when I saw something valuable, I worked to earn it. I planted trees, I improved the land, I invested my time and money in hope in making something beautiful. When you saw something valuable, you schemed to steal it from someone you thought couldn't stop you." The final settlement, reached late on Friday afternoon as courthouse clerks were preparing to close for the weekend, was larger than anyone except Thomas Chen had expected. $160 million, paid over 3 years to minimize tax implications. With the mineral rights fully restored to Evelyn and all mining operations transferred to her control. Margaret Holloway's real estate license was revoked. Apex Mining dissolved under the weight of punitive damages, and the entire scheme became the subject of a state attorney general's investigation into elder fraud that would eventually result in criminal charges. But for Evelyn, sitting in Thomas Chen's office as he explained the payment schedule and tax implications and investment options that came with sudden wealth, the most important moment was quieter, more personal. "Mrs. Martinez, you realize what this means, don't you? You're going to be one of the wealthiest women in the state. Your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, none of them will ever have to worry about money again." Evelyn nodded, understanding the magnitude of what had happened while feeling strangely disconnected from the numbers being discussed. $160 million was an abstraction, too large to feel real. But the knowledge that her apple trees would never be destroyed by mining equipment, that her 2 acres of sandy soil would remain hers to do with as she chose, that felt real in a way that made her chest tight with emotion. That evening, she called her children to a family dinner at Roberto's house,
the same living room where they had argued about her worthless land purchase nearly 2 years earlier. The conversation was different this time, subdued by the magnitude of what had transpired and complicated by emotions none of them had experienced processing. "Mama," Roberto said, his voice carrying the weight of months of guilt and amazement, "I owe you an apology. A big one. I was wrong about everything." "You were trying to protect me," she replied, though they both knew his motivations had been more complex than simple protection. "You thought you knew what was best." "I thought I was smarter than you. I thought my education and my job qualified me to make decisions about your life. I was arrogant and wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology felt important, but not as important as what came next. Over dinner, tamales that Maria had spent all day making, the first time in years she had cooked something that took real time and effort, they talked about what the money meant, what it could do, what responsibilities came with wealth that none of them had imagined possessing. "The lawyers are recommending we set up a family foundation," Elena explained, her nurse's practicality helping her process the financial implications more easily than her siblings. "Tax advantages, structured giving, professional management of the investments." "What would we do with a foundation? I mean, what kind of causes would we support?" Evelyn set down her fork and looked around the table at her children, seeing them not as the successful adults they'd become, but as the young people she'd raised on hope and stubbornness and the absolute belief that tomorrow could be better than today if you were willing to work for it. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "About your great-grandmother, about the seeds she gave me, about what she taught me about listening to the earth. I think we should help other people plant things. Not just trees, but dreams, ideas, businesses, futures."
Rather than focusing on traditional charitable causes, the foundation specialized in providing resources for people whose dreams had been dismissed as impossible or impractical. Small business loans for immigrants starting restaurants in neighborhoods where banks wouldn't lend. Scholarships for students whose academic records didn't reflect their potential. Grants for community gardens in urban areas where fresh food was scarce but hope was abundant. To establish the Martinez Center for Sustainable Agriculture, a research facility located on Evelyn's original 2 acres, where scientists studied techniques for growing food crops in challenging soil conditions. The apple trees that had started everything became the centerpiece of experimental orchards, where agricultural students learned that the line between impossible and inevitable was often just a matter of patience, persistence, and proper soil preparation. Where she'd been living, renovating it into affordable housing for elderly residents who wanted independence without isolation. The building featured communal gardens where residents could grow vegetables and flowers, workshop spaces where people could pursue hobbies and crafts, and a library stocked with books in multiple languages that told stories about people who had accomplished extraordinary things despite ordinary beginnings. She kept her original apartment, with its view of the parking lot and its small balcony, because it reminded her of where she'd been when she thought her dreams were too small for anyone else to understand. On quiet evenings, she would sit on that balcony, with a cup of coffee and a mason jar full of sapphires, watching the sun set behind mountains that looked purple and mysterious in the distance. The mining operation that eventually extracted minerals from her land was small, careful, and respectful of the environment in ways that Apex's industrial approach never would have been. Evelyn insisted on hiring local workers, using sustainable extraction methods, and donating a percentage of profits to environmental restoration projects. The sapphires that emerged from her sandy soil were some of the finest ever found in North America, but they were extracted in ways that honored the land that had hidden them for millions of years. And infrastructure development. Elena left her hospital job to run the foundation's healthcare initiatives, focusing on providing medical services in rural areas where doctors were scarce. Even Roberto, humbled by his mistakes and genuinely committed to making amends, used his financial expertise to manage investments and ensure the foundation's resources would last for generations. Maria remained skeptical of the whole enterprise,
worried about tax implications and public scrutiny and the possibility that sudden wealth would attract the wrong kind of attention. But even she found herself drawn into the foundation's work when they began providing business development services for women starting their own companies, a cause that resonated with her own struggles to establish herself in male-dominated industries. 2 years after the settlement, Evelyn stood in the renovated community center that had been built on the site of her former apartment complex, watching her granddaughter Sophia help elderly residents plant seedlings in raised garden beds designed for people with arthritis and mobility limitations. The center was busy and warm and alive with the kind of purposeful activity that came from people pursuing goals they cared about. "Abuela," Sophia said, her 10-year-old hands dirty from potting soil and her face bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bought that land?" Evelyn considered the question, looking around at the community that had grown from a single decision to plant apple trees in impossible ground. "I think your great-great-grandmother would say that some things are meant to be, mija, that the earth calls to the right people at the right time, and the only choice we have is whether we're brave enough to listen." "Do you think the land really called to you?" "I think," she said, picking up a handful of potting soil and letting it run through her fingers the way she'd once let sandy soil mixed with sapphire fragments run through her hands, "that sometimes what calls to us isn't the land or the money or the dreams we think we want. Sometimes what calls to us is the chance to become who we were always supposed to be." That evening, she drove out to her original property, where the apple trees now stood 8 feet tall and heavy with fruit that tasted like hope fulfilled. The mining operation had been completed months earlier. The extracted sapphires sold to collectors and jewelers around the world who appreciated stones that carried stories as well as beauty. The land had been restored to its original condition, sandy soil and hardy grasses, and the vast open sky that had first made her feel rich. She walked slowly across the 2 acres that had changed her life, thinking about the difference between what people thought they wanted and what they actually needed. The world saw her as a lottery winner, someone who had stumbled into wealth through luck and legal persistence. But Evelyn knew the truth was more complicated and more wonderful than that. She hadn't become wealthy because she'd found sapphires in sandy soil. She'd become wealthy because she'd learned to recognize treasure in places where other people saw only worthless ground. Because she'd developed the patience to plant apple trees that wouldn't bear fruit for years. Because she'd discovered that the most valuable things in life were often hidden in the roots of seemingly impossible dreams. Standing there in the fading light, surrounded by acres of possibility and the sound of wind moving through grass that had somehow learned to thrive in sand, Evelyn Martinez felt exactly as rich as she had the day she'd first planted trees in ground everyone else said was too poor to grow anything beautiful. The difference was that now the whole world could see what she'd always known, that wealth wasn't about the treasure you found, but about the wisdom to recognize it when you did. 12 years after the first apple tree was planted in sandy soil that everyone said was worthless, Dr. Sophia Martinez Chen stood at the podium of the International Conference on Sustainable Agriculture, looking out at an audience of scientists, policymakers, and agricultural innovators from 37 countries. At 20 years old, she was the youngest keynote speaker in the conference's history, but her research on crop adaptation in challenging soil conditions had already changed how agricultural scientists thought about the relationship between land quality and food security. "My great-grandmother used to say that the earth tells you its secrets if you know how to be still," Sophia began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had grown up believing that impossible was just another word for undiscovered. But she also taught my grandmother that listening isn't passive. True listening requires the courage to act on what you hear, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. In the audience, Evelyn Martinez sat in the front row,
her 83-year-old hands folded over a purse that contained photographs of apple trees now 15 feet tall and heavy with fruit that fed families throughout the county. Beside her sat Carlos, grayer now but still strong, his construction company having evolved into a sustainable development firm that specialized in building communities where gardens and housing co-ops coexisted in harmony. Sophia's presentation focused on the agricultural research that had grown from those first experimental plantings on Evelyn's 2 acres. The Martinez Center for Sustainable Agriculture had become a global leader in developing crop varieties that could thrive in marginal soils, techniques that were already helping farmers in drought-stricken regions of Africa, Asia, and South America feed their communities from land that had previously been considered too poor for cultivation. The breakthrough wasn't in changing the soil, Sophia explained, showing slides of root systems that had learned to extract nutrients from sand and clay and hardpan that conventional wisdom said could never support agriculture. The breakthrough was in understanding that plants, like people, are more resilient than we assume. They can adapt to conditions that seem impossible, but only if we give them time, patience, and the right kind of support. The research had implications far beyond agriculture. Urban planners were using Martinez Center techniques to establish food forests in abandoned lots. Environmental restoration specialists were applying their methods to rehabilitate land damaged by mining and industrial pollution. Even psychologists had begun studying the center's approach as a model for human resilience, examining how communities could thrive in challenging circumstances by developing deeper, more sustainable root systems. After the presentation, as delegates crowded around Sophia with questions and collaboration requests, Evelyn slipped outside to a balcony that overlooked the city where she had once cleaned office buildings at night while her children slept. The view was different now, dotted with community gardens and green spaces that bore small plaques acknowledging funding from the Martinez Foundation. But the mountains in the distance looked exactly the same as they had when she first saw them through the window of a bus taking her to look at land nobody wanted.
Proud of your granddaughter? The voice belonged to Thomas Chen, now in his 60s and serving as the foundation's legal counsel. His hair silver, but his energy unchanged by the decade that had passed since their first meeting in a courthouse that smelled of old dreams. Proud, yes, but not surprised. Evelyn smiled, thinking of the little girl who had once held a mason jar full of sapphire fragments up to the light, watching rainbows scatter across apartment walls. She's always seen possibilities where other people saw problems. Like her great-grandmother. Like all of us, when we remember to listen carefully enough. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, officials who had traveled from Rome to discuss expanding the Martinez Center's techniques to refugee camps where traditional farming was impossible but food security remained critical. Sophia moved easily between English and Spanish as she explained adaptation strategies, her bilingual fluency a gift from summers spent working alongside her great-grandmother in gardens where languages mixed as naturally as soil and seeds. Watching her granddaughter navigate complex international negotiations with the same quiet confidence Evelyn had once used to raise 5 children on factory wages, Evelyn felt the peculiar satisfaction that comes from seeing patterns repeat across generations, not identically, but with variations that suggested growth, evolution, improvement. The evening's formal dinner was held in a ballroom that cost more to rent for one night than Evelyn had once earned in a year. But she found herself thinking about a different kind of abundance as she listened to speeches about global food security and sustainable development. Wealth, she had learned, was like water. It could nourish, or it could flood, depending on how carefully you channeled it. The Martinez Foundation had grown beyond anything she had imagined during those first conversations around Roberto's dining room table.
The original endowment had been invested so carefully that it now generates more in annual interest than the family could spend on charitable activities, creating a self-sustaining cycle of giving that would continue long after Evelyn was gone. But more than the money, it was the philosophy that had proved most valuable. The idea that the most important investments were in people and dreams that others had written off as impossible. Roberto, now serving as the foundation's president, approached her table carrying an envelope marked with the familiar logo of the Nobel Committee. "Mama, this came for Sophia today. She asked me to give it to you first." Inside was a letter informing Dr. Sophia Martinez Chen that she had been selected as the youngest recipient in the history of the World Food Prize, agriculture's equivalent of the Nobel Peace Prize, for her research on adaptive crop systems that had already helped establish sustainable food production in 12 countries where traditional farming had failed. 20 years old, Roberto marveled, his voice carrying the wonder of someone who had learned to see his family members clearly only after nearly losing the chance to do so. "When I was 20, I thought I knew everything. She actually does know everything." "She knows what matters," Evelyn corrected gently. "There's a difference." After the dinner ended and the delegates returned to their hotels to prepare for morning flights to conferences in capitals around the world, Evelyn found herself alone with Sophia in the hotel's rooftop garden, a space that had been designed according to Martinez Center principles and featured raised beds where vegetables grew alongside flowers that attracted pollinators from across the urban ecosystem. "Abuela, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been stubborn enough to buy that land?" It was a question Sophia had asked many times over the years, in different forms, and Evelyn's answer had evolved as she'd grown older and presumably wiser. Tonight, looking out over a city that sparkled with lights that represented millions of individual dreams and struggles and small acts of daily courage, she felt closer to the truth than she ever had before. "I think," she said slowly, "that the land was waiting for someone who was ready to see what it could become rather than what it appeared to be. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else, someone who had learned to recognize treasure in unlikely places."
But it was you. It was your decision, your courage, your refusal to listen when everyone said you were making a mistake. Evelyn picked a tomato from one of the garden's vines, feeling its weight and warmth in her palm, thinking about all the small decisions that had led to this moment. A hotel rooftop where her great-granddaughter grew food in the sky above a city where she had once been invisible, ignored, dismissed as too old and too poor to matter. "Sophia, mija, I want to tell you something I've never told anyone else. The day I bought that land, I was scared. Terrified, actually. I knew Roberto was right about the money, knew I was risking everything I had on what might have been a foolish dream. But I also knew that if I didn't take that risk, if I let fear make my decisions for me, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible. So what changed? What made you brave enough to do it anyway?" Evelyn considered the question, thinking about the young woman who had raised 5 children alone, who had worked night shifts and borrowed against tomorrow to pay for today, who had planted apple trees in sand because she believed something beautiful could grow there. I realized that being afraid of failing wasn't a good enough reason not to try. Failing would have meant losing $400 and looking foolish in front of my children, but not trying would have meant losing something much more valuable, the part of myself that believed in possibilities other people couldn't see. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city settle into evening rhythms, lights coming on in windows where families gathered for dinner, where students studied for exams, where people made small decisions that would shape the future in ways they couldn't yet imagine.
Abuela, the prize committee wants to know if you'll introduce me at the award ceremony. They said it would be meaningful to have multiple generations represented. What did you tell them? I told them I'd have to ask the woman who taught me that the most important things in life usually grow slowly, in places where nobody expects to find them. The award ceremony took place 6 months later in a concert hall that had been built during the Depression by craftsmen who believed that beauty was essential even in hard times, especially in hard times. Evelyn wore a dress that Sophia had helped her choose, elegant but comfortable, the deep blue of sapphires caught in candlelight. Standing at the podium where presidents and prime ministers had spoken, looking out at an audience that included agricultural scientists, policymakers, and journalists from around the world, Evelyn felt the peculiar lightness that comes from understanding that your story had become larger than your own life, that the seeds you had planted would continue growing long after you were gone. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here tonight not as someone who accomplished great things, but as someone who learned to pay attention to the possibilities hidden in ordinary moments. My great-granddaughter, Sophia, is receiving this award for research that began with apple trees planted in sandy soil that everyone said was too poor to grow anything worthwhile. She paused, looking directly at Sophia, who sat in the front row wearing the same expression of patient attention she'd had as a child, listening to stories about great-grandmothers who planted fruit trees in impossible ground. But the real discovery wasn't the sapphires we found in that soil, valuable as they were. The real discovery was learning that the most precious things in life are often hidden in the roots of dreams that other people dismiss as foolish. Sophia's research has helped feed hungry people around the world, not because she was smarter than other scientists, but because she was raised to believe that impossible is just another word for undiscovered. The applause that followed felt less like recognition and more like agreement, as if the audience was responding not just to her words, but to some shared understanding about the relationship between individual courage and collective progress.
After the ceremony, as photographers captured images of 4 generations of Martinez women, Evelyn, Elena, Sophia, and Carlos's infant daughter Isabella, who slipped peacefully through the celebration, Evelyn found herself thinking about her grandmother, about seeds pressed into a small palm with whispered instructions to listen carefully to the earth. The cycle was completing itself and beginning again, as all the most important cycles did. Isabella would grow up in the world where the Martinez Foundation provided opportunities for dreamers who had been dismissed as impractical, where the Martinez Center helped farmers grow food in land that had been written off as worthless, where her great-great-grandmother's story served as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things if they were stubborn enough to keep planting seeds in ground that looked impossible. But more than the institutional legacy, more than the money or the recognition or the global impact, what Evelyn treasured most was simpler and more personal. On quiet Sunday afternoons, she would drive out to her original 2 acres, where the apple trees now formed a small orchard that produced fruit for the local food bank. The land had been restored after the mining operation, but you could still see traces of where the sapphires had been extracted, slightly different soil, areas where the grass grew greener because of minerals that remained in the earth. She would walk slowly through the orchard, touching the trunks of trees that had survived winter winds and summer droughts, that had found ways to thrive in sand that everyone said would never support life. Sometimes Carlos joined her, sometimes Sophia, sometimes she walked alone, listening to the sound of wind through leaves that rustled with the quiet satisfaction of problems solved and promises kept. On her 85th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the community center that had been built where her sterile apartment had once stood, Evelyn received a gift that surprised her more than the World Food Prize or the Presidential Commendation or any of the honors that had accumulated over the years. It was a mason jar filled with sapphires, but these weren't from her original collection. These were stones that had been found by children participating in the Foundation's Youth Agriculture Program. Kids who had been taught to pay attention to interesting rocks while learning to grow vegetables in urban gardens, to recognize treasure in unlikely places while developing practical skills for feeding themselves and their communities. "We thought you should have these, Abuela," Sophia explained, as Evelyn held the jar up to the light, watching tiny rainbows scatter across the walls of a room filled with people whose lives had been touched by decisions made decades earlier in a moment of desperate hope. The kids found them while digging in the demonstration gardens. They're not as big as your original collection, but they're just as real. Evelyn looked around the room at faces that represented the ripple effects of a single choice to plant apple trees in sand. Her children, who had learned to see possibilities instead of problems. Her grandchildren, who were building careers around making the impossible inevitable. Her great-grandchildren, who would grow up in a world where their great-great-grandmother's story served as proof that dreams were worth pursuing regardless of the odds. "They're beautiful," she said, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with monetary value and everything to do with the understanding that the most precious things in life were often hidden in the most ordinary moments, waiting for someone patient enough to dig carefully, stubborn enough to plant seeds in impossible ground, and wise enough to recognize treasure when they found it. That night, as the celebration wound down and family members prepared to return to homes and careers and lives that had been shaped by decisions made in sandy soil that nobody wanted, Evelyn sat on her balcony one last time, holding the new jar of sapphires and thinking about the difference between endings and completions. The story that had begun with a foreclosure notice and a desperate gamble on worthless land was ending, but what it had created, the foundation, the research center, the community of people who believed that impossible was just another word for undiscovered, would continue growing long after she was gone, roots deepening with each passing year, branches spreading in directions she couldn't predict but could trust to be good. Somewhere across the city, in demonstration gardens and research facilities, and homes where families gathered around dinner tables, seeds were being planted by people who had learned to recognize treasure in unlikely places. And somewhere in the future that those seeds would create, children not yet born would discover that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or land or even wisdom, but the understanding that the earth was always ready to reveal its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen, stubborn enough to dig, and brave enough to plant dreams in ground that everyone else said was too poor to grow anything worthwhile. The sapphires glittered in their jar, catching light from windows where people were making small decisions that would shape the future in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But Evelyn's story wasn't quite finished yet. 3 months after her 85th birthday celebration, she received a phone call that would add one final chapter to a life already full of unexpected turns. The caller was Dr. James Patterson from the Smithsonian Institution, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had spent his career studying geological formations and had just encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about mineral deposits. "Mrs. Martinez, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've been studying the geological reports from your property for the past year, and I believe we may have overlooked something significant, something that could change our understanding of sapphire formation in North America." Evelyn listened as Dr. Patterson explained that recent advances in geological imaging had revealed something extraordinary beneath her 2 acres. The sapphire deposits they had mined were only the surface layer of something much larger and more complex, a geological formation that extended deep into the earth and covered an area much larger than anyone had suspected. "Mrs. Martinez, based on our new imaging, your property sits atop what appears to be the largest natural sapphire deposit ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere. The stones we extracted barely touch the surface of what's down there. We're talking about a formation that could yield gemstones worth potentially $1 billion or more. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless in the way that astronomical distances felt meaningless, intellectually comprehensible but emotionally impossible to grasp. Evelyn found herself thinking not about money, but about her grandmother's words, about the earth revealing its secrets when the time was right. Dr. Patterson, I'm 85 years old. I've already seen more wealth than I ever imagined possible. What exactly are you proposing? The Smithsonian would like to establish a long-term research partnership with your foundation. Instead of traditional mining, we'd like to study the formation using non-invasive techniques, understanding how these deposits formed over millions of years. The knowledge we gain could revolutionize our understanding of precious stone geology and potentially lead to the discovery of similar formations worldwide. The partnership that emerged from that phone call was unlike anything in the history of geological research. The Martinez-Smithsonian Geological Research Initiative combined cutting-edge scientific equipment with the Foundation's commitment to community benefit, creating a unique model for how academic research could serve both scientific knowledge and social good. Over the following months, Evelyn watched teams of scientists use ground-penetrating radar, seismic imaging, and other technologies she barely understood to map the incredible complexity of what lay beneath her apple orchard. The formations were unlike anything previously discovered, crystalline structures that had formed over millions of years under conditions that geologists were still trying to understand. But more fascinating than the scientific discoveries were the human stories that emerged from the research. Graduate students from around the world came to study the formations, many of them first-generation college students whose families had immigrated from countries where higher education was a luxury few could afford. Evelyn made it her business to know their stories, inviting them to Sunday dinners at the community center, where they would explain their research in languages that mixed technical terminology with the excitement of discovery.
One of those students was Dr. Amara Okafor, a young geologist from Nigeria whose doctoral dissertation on crystalline formations in challenging environments had caught the attention of the Smithsonian team. Amara's family had been displaced by mining operations that had destroyed their village without compensation, and she had dedicated her career to developing mining techniques that benefited local communities rather than exploiting them. "Mrs. Martinez," Amara said during one of their Sunday dinner conversations, "what you've created here is what my grandfather dreamed of when the mining companies came to our village, a way for the Earth's treasures to benefit the people who live above them rather than making them poorer." Evelyn found in Amara a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the most important discoveries weren't about what you found, but about what you did with what you found. When Amara's research revealed that the geological conditions that had created Evelyn's Sapphire deposits existed in several other locations around the world, including areas near Amara's family's original village in Nigeria, the Foundation funded expeditions to investigate those sites. The discoveries that followed created a new model for geological research and mineral extraction. Communities that had been exploited by traditional mining companies found themselves partners in scientific endeavors that brought education, employment, and economic development while preserving environmental integrity. The Martinez method, as it came to be known in academic journals, proved that geological wealth could be shared rather than stolen, studied rather than simply extracted. But perhaps the most meaningful discovery of all came from an unexpected source. Carlos's daughter, Isabella, now 5 years old and already showing signs of the family's stubborn curiosity, spent her afternoons after school at the research site, asking questions that made PhD students reconsider their assumptions, and drawing pictures of rock formations with the unselfconscious artistry of someone who saw beauty where others saw only scientific data. It was Isabella who noticed something the sophisticated imaging equipment had missed.
While playing in the area where the original apple trees still grew, she discovered that the largest and healthiest trees were growing in precise alignment with the deepest sapphire formations, as if the roots had somehow sensed the presence of the crystals and grown toward them. "Great-Grandma Evie," she announced with the confidence of someone too young to understand that her observation might be impossible, "the trees know where the pretty rocks are. They're friends." The botanical research that followed Isabella's observation revealed something that challenged conventional understanding of plant biology. The apple tree's root systems had indeed grown preferentially toward the sapphire deposits, and chemical analysis showed that the trees were somehow extracting trace minerals from the crystalline formations, minerals that made their fruit not only more nutritious, but more resistant to disease and environmental stress. Dr. Sarah Kim, the botanist who led the investigation, described the discovery as potentially revolutionary for both horticulture and geology. It appears that these trees have developed a symbiotic relationship with the mineral deposits. They're drawing nutrients from the sapphires that enhance their growth, while their root systems are creating microenvironments that may actually encourage crystal formation. The implications extended far beyond Evelyn's 2 acres. If plants could be bred to form similar relationships with mineral deposits, it might be possible to identify valuable geological formations through vegetation patterns, to use agriculture as a form of non-invasive geological exploration. More intriguingly, it might be possible to enhance crop nutrition by intentionally cultivating plants near specific mineral formations. Isabella's discovery earned her recognition as the youngest person ever to contribute to a peer-reviewed geological journal. But for Evelyn, the real significance was more personal. Her great-great-granddaughter had demonstrated the same ability to see connections that others missed, to ask questions that led to unexpected discoveries, to find treasure in places where experts had looked and found nothing unusual.
On Isabella's 6th birthday, Evelyn gave her a gift that had special meaning: a small shovel, child-sized but made from the same high-quality steel that professional archaeologists used, engraved with words that had been passed down through 5 generations of Martinez women. "Listen carefully. The earth tells you its secrets if you know how to be still." The birthday party was held in the apple orchard, where the original 12 trees now formed the center of a grove that included varieties from around the world, all thriving in soil that everyone had once said was too poor to support life. Scientists, family members, and community children played together among trees that had become living symbols of the connection between patience, persistence, and seemingly impossible dreams. As the celebration continued around her, Evelyn found herself drawn to a quiet corner of the orchard, where a small memorial garden honored her grandmother, the woman whose wisdom about seeds and soil and stubborn hope had started everything. The memorial was simple, a bench surrounded by herbs and flowers that attracted butterflies, with a small plaque that quoted her grandmother's most important lesson: "The most beautiful things grow slowly, in places where nobody expects to find them." Sitting on that bench, watching Isabella use her new shovel to help younger children plant flower seeds in carefully prepared soil, Evelyn felt the particular satisfaction that comes from seeing patterns complete themselves across generations. The child who's planting seeds today would grow up in a world where her family's story served as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, where the Martinez Foundation would continue creating opportunities for dreamers long after Evelyn was gone, where research inspired by apple trees and sapphires would help feed hungry people and understand the Earth's mysteries for decades to come. But more than the institutional legacy, more than the scientific discoveries or the financial resources that would outlive her, what Evelyn treasured most was the understanding that she had been part of something larger than her individual life. Her decision to plant apple trees in sandy soil had created ripples that extended around the world, touching the lives of people she would never meet, inspiring discoveries that would benefit generations not yet born. As the sun began to set over the mountains that had witnessed her entire journey from desperate hope to impossible fulfillment, Evelyn closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of children playing in an orchard that existed because she had been stubborn enough to plant trees in ground that everyone said was worthless. The laughter and excited voices created a symphony of possibility, a soundtrack for dreams that were still taking root, still growing toward discoveries that couldn't yet be imagined. When she opened her eyes, Isabella was standing beside the bench, her small hands dirty from gardening, her face bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work. "Great-Grandma Evie, I planted extra seeds for you, right next to the biggest apple tree. So when they grow up, they can be friends with the tree and the pretty rocks underneath." Evelyn took Isabella's small hand in her aged one, feeling the calluses that came from honest work, the strength that would grow into the ability to move mountains if necessary, the gentleness that would nurture dreams in places where others saw only problems. "Thank you, mija. That's perfect. Great-Grandma Evie, when I grow up, I want to find treasures like you did, but I want to find them in places where people really need them." "What kind of places?" Isabella considered the question with the serious attention of someone who understood that dreams were important business. Places where kids don't have enough food, places where the ground is too sad to grow anything beautiful, places where people forgot that impossible things can happen if you're brave enough to dig. Evelyn squeezed her great-great-granddaughter's hand, feeling the continuation of something that started with seeds pressed into a small palm decades ago in another country, by another grandmother who understood that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money, but wisdom about recognizing treasure in unlikely places. Then that's exactly what you'll do. And when you do, you'll remember that the most beautiful things grow slowly, quietly, in the roots of dreams that other people think are foolish. As they walked hand in hand back toward the celebration, where 4 generations of Martinez women were teaching children from around the world about the connection between patience and possibility, Evelyn Martinez smiled and began planning tomorrow's work in gardens where the most precious discoveries were always just one carefully planted seed away from changing everything.
And in the growing darkness of evening, the earth continued its ancient work of nurturing seeds that would become forests, dreams that would become realities, and hopes that would become legacies lasting far beyond the lives of the dreamers who first dared to plant them. Evelyn's story proves that it's never too late to plant dreams in impossible places. If this tale inspired you to believe in your own possibilities, please like, share, and subscribe. And remember that your most valuable discoveries might be waiting in the places others call worthless.